I was on my favorite online marketplace when I saw an ad giving away a free TV and a chainsaw. Now, I wasn't interested in the TV, but I was interested in the chainsaw. Luckily, they weren't asking for both to be taken. The only issue was the distance to the location. It was over 20 miles away, and with traffic, it was going to take over 30 minutes to get there. The chances that I would make it there in time before someone else wasn't looking very good, but you could probably guess what the outcome was. What's up everyone, and thank you for stopping by. Today's project is this Poulan Pro chainsaw, and the problem is that I don't know anything about it. However, it's pretty safe to say that more than likely it either won't start or has a serious running issue. Now, I'm going to try and repair this chainsaw. However, it may not be the exact repair you need to make to yours. We'll explore other options later in the video. Now, we're only going to mention what these other options could be. We don't have enough time to look into them, but if you need more information on these options, you're welcome to ask as many questions as you need to. So I noticed this piece of string on the back of the handle. Now, I don't ever take my equipment to the shop, but this looks like it might have had a service tag on it. I wonder if another shop may have worked on this chainsaw. The next thing I noticed is that there's fuel in the bulb, and that if I press on it, I can hear it working to move fuel around the system, which means there's more than likely some fuel still left in the tank. If we look inside the fuel tank, there's still some fuel in it, so someone must have tried to start it and wasn't able to, so they must have put it on the curb. The next thing I want to do is to try and start it and see what it does and doesn't do. Who knows, maybe they just flooded the engine because they weren't following the instructions. So it didn't even try and start, which is not good news. The most obvious issue is the choke, which does not seem to be working and is essential to getting this chainsaw started. Now, since I have a clear issue, I'm going to address it first before going on with more diagnostic work like checking for spark and compression. I'm not saying that those two aren't important to check, it's just my choice to check the obvious issue first. When I pull on the blue choke lever, it closes the choke flap, but it's supposed to stay closed. Instead, it opens up again, which will not help this engine get started. On the other side of the carb are all the levers, and as you can see, the choke lever is supposed to interact with the other levers, but it's not doing that. If I squeeze the trigger, you can see that the throttle cable moves the levers, but the choke lever still won't interact with them. The second air inlet is opened by the trigger as well and is connected to the throttle plate by another rod that slides on a brass pin on the far side of the throttle lever. However, that's when I noticed that it's not sliding at all. In fact, it's stuck in one location, and that's causing the choke not to interact with it. I'm going to reset it by manually moving it, and as you can see, the rod is now in a different location. At this point, the choke lever should now interact with it. If I pull on the blue choke lever, it's now staying closed, which is exactly how it's supposed to work. When I try and start it again, we should have a better chance. This is when I noticed a very strange issue. It looks like this rubber seal has been cut away. I wonder if this rod was hitting the rubber and causing some throttle issues. I also noticed that this bolt is missing, which may not seem important, but I want to replace it just because that's the way it came from the factory. So of course it didn't start. In fact, it didn't even try and start. That means we have a very serious issue, either spark or fuel related. The next thing I want to do is to look at the fuel and see if there's a problem with it. There wasn't much in the tank, but it was enough to prime the fuel system. By its smell and its color, it is fresh, so I don't think we have bad fuel. However, I don't completely agree with its color. Now, it's not as dark as I would like it to be, meaning there might not be enough 2-cycle oil in it. I'm going to quickly mix a fresh batch of fuel using 1 ounce of 2-cycle oil and 40 ounces of 89 octane 100% gasoline with no ethanol. I like to mix my fuel in 40 ounce batches because I'm comfortable doing it this way versus a gallon at a time. After pouring the majority of it into the container, I'll pour some of it into the jar, roughly the same amount as before, and then compare it to what came out of the saw. So I can already see there's a slight difference in color, but we need to set them side by side to see if there's a real difference. As you can see, there's definitely more color in the fuel I just mixed versus what came out of the tank. The only thing I could think of is that they're mixing their fuel by eye, or they're using the wrong mixture of 50-1, because according to the owner's manual, this saw requires a 40-1 mixture. The reason this is important is because if there's not enough oil mixed with the gasoline, it could cause premature engine wear, which just means it's going to fail a lot sooner than it's supposed to. So unfortunately, I'm considering this the first of many issues with this chainsaw, and we haven't gotten that far into it yet. We didn't have to wait very long to find our next issue. This is a brand new generic air filter, and of course, it's not going to fit right out of the box. That means you need to make it fit. In this case, they made it even worse. Now, the shape of the air filter base is very complex, and you need to be somewhat careful when cutting it to fit, but as you can see, it didn't happen here. They cut the far right side too much, and now it doesn't fit well, which means dirt and sawdust is going to get inside the engine. Unfortunately, this means we need to replace it. Yet another issue is that there's supposed to be a bolt here, but as you can see, it's missing, so we need to replace it as well. From what I've seen, it looks like someone tried to fix the chainsaw by throwing new parts at it, but their attention to detail was a bit lacking. The next thing to do is to remove the carb so we can inspect the fuel lines and look for anything else that might have been left off this machine. This fuel line here is the fuel filter line, and by the looks of it, it appears to be brand new. The only issue is that the other fuel line, which is the fuel return line and runs from the fuel tank to the purge bulb, is not new. Instead, it's the old fuel line. This is yet another example of the lack of detailed work that was done on this machine. Now, after removing the first screw for the recoil, I noticed that the other screw is missing. That means we have 2 screws missing so far, and hate to say it, but the total for these 2 screws is a whopping $14 to replace, which is absolutely ridiculous. In my book, this sort of sloppy work is getting very costly. Now, these are all the screws I removed from the recoil. They're all supposed to be a coarse thread screw, but as you can see, one of them is shorter and a fine thread. This odd bolt is the one we're missing from the air filter base, which saves us from having to replace it. Unfortunately, that means we still have 2 of the coarse screws to replace. Now, after removing the recoil, I can see the purge bulb, and it looks brand new as well, so we don't have to replace it, but that's the reason why we have 2 missing screws, because they had to remove them to get to the bulb. As we guessed earlier, the fuel filter is brand new, which confirms that someone did work on this chainsaw. Unfortunately, there needs to be a little bit more line in the tank so the filter can reach the bottom, which isn't that difficult to do. The last thing we need to do to remove the carb from the engine is to disconnect the fuel lines and then slide it off its studs, but this is when we find yet another example of poor work from the last person who worked on this thing. There's supposed to be a boot here sealing the second air inlet to the intake adapter. With this missing, there's a massive air leak that's not going to let the carb work to deliver fuel to the engine. This is more than likely the reason why this engine won't start. Now, after getting the carb off the studs, I realized how clean it was and that the gasket for it is not stuck to it, which means it's not original to the engine, and that this carb is more than likely a brand new aftermarket replacement. I'm almost certain that this carb is in working condition, and I'm not going to inspect it. Now, should I inspect it? Yes, but I think I'd be wasting my time doing so. Now, I'm going to be transparent for a moment. These repairs don't always happen in one day. Sometimes I have to wait for parts, and other times plans change, and I have to finish the repair on a different day. That's what happened here. Now, while off camera, I was able to confirm that this engine does run when I was able to seal off that leak we found earlier, so I do apologize that I didn't show it, but I did confirm that this does run before continuing with this repair. Always make sure that your machine has the ability to run before you commit to buying parts and devoting your time to a repair. After running a new return line and putting on that plastic splice I found in the tank, I can now pull all the line out of the tank until it stops. The job of the splice is to keep the line from coming out of the tank. I can now cut the line so it can connect it to the longer port on the purge bulb. I also need to cut a short piece of line to connect to the short port on the bulb, which will then connect to the left side port on the carb. To deal with the missing boot, I'm going to use a temporary replacement. If this works for the most part, and I can confirm there isn't anything terribly wrong with the chainsaw, I'll consider buying the part I need. I know it sounds terrible, but I don't want to commit to buying an $8 piece of rubber unless I know it's going to work. Now, I thought I had gotten past all the shoddy work, but apparently I was wrong. This is the gasket they put along with the new carb, and it turns out it's the wrong one. There's an impulse signal from the engine at the bottom of the intake adapter. The gasket is supposed to seal this opening, however, this gasket does not have an opening for it. You can barely see the imprint for the opening on the new gasket. Now, this is the correct gasket, which I had from a different carb kit. As you can see, once I put it on the back side of the carb, the openings line up, and it also lines up with the opening on the intake adapter. I don't know if I can take any more of these wonderful surprises, and I hate to tell you this isn't the last one I'll find. Once I think I've gotten everything squared away, I'm going to reconnect the short fuel line that came from the shorter port on the purge bulb to the brass port on the left side of the carb. Then I'll slide the carb back onto its studs and then reconnect the fuel filter line, which will go to the brass port on the right side of the carb. Once the fuel lines have all been reconnected, I'm going to put that fuel I just mixed up into the tank so I can test the fuel flow through the system. Now when pressing the bulb, fuel will flow from this filter line into the port on the right side of the carb. The fuel will then make its way through the carb and out the left side port into the shorter port on the bulb, partially fill the bulb, and then out the longer port through the return line and back to the tank. I know it's moving kind of fast and all at the same time, and that's because the bulb already had fuel in it. If it had been empty, the action would have been a little bit easier to follow. However, the fuel was moving through the lines like it's supposed to, so the fuel system is now ready for our next start. Now, if you don't see any fuel moving through your lines, there might be a problem with the carb or the bulb, and I would consider replacing either one. The other option would be a clogged fuel filter, and if that's the case, you'll need to remove the filter and clean it with some carb cleaner. Now, before replacing the recoil, I'm going to spray some lubricant on the posts for the starter pawls. It's not necessary, but it will keep it from wearing out due to excessive friction. When putting the screws back in and you're using a power tool, make sure you have the clutch on its lowest setting, otherwise you could strip out the plastic threads in the body of the saw. I'm also going to use the mangled air filter until I get the new one in. I know it's been compromised, but it's better than running without any air filter. So I was being very irresponsible. I should have stopped the engine immediately when I realized the idle speed was too high, causing the chain to keep moving. Now I did try to make a few adjustments to the L screw, but as you'll see, it didn't go very well. As you just heard, it's still over revving and it won't idle down either. I did try making a few other adjustments, but it seems like the throttle is hanging up somewhere. The best thing to do is to look at the throttle system and see if there's an issue. If I squeeze on the trigger, you can see how the levers move on the right side of the carb. I think the top part of the larger lever is making contact with the rubber seal. The problem is it looks like it's clearing the seal just fine, but if we look at the cover, you can see that this edge will make contact with that seal. With the cover down, it could cause enough contact to get in the way of the levers. The scratches on the side also indicates that the end of the upper rod might be making contact with it as well. Now to test this, I'm going to cut a small piece off that seal and then try starting the engine again and see if we still have an issue. For this test, I'm also going to start it without the top cover. I wouldn't do this for very long as the cover helps keep the engine cool. Just to let you know, the results of this test were very interesting. As I was replacing the cover, I hit the off switch, and that's why the engine stopped. It looks as though the over-revving and the hanging throttle have now gone. After a few slight carb adjustments, it also seems like it's running a lot better as well. I'm going to start it again and maybe make some test cuts. So this has to be the strangest problem I have ever seen on a chainsaw. Somehow the cover is interfering with the throttle system and causing a very dangerous problem. Unfortunately, this is where we have to leave the problem, and the main reason is if we kept going, this video would be almost 30 minutes long, which in my book is way too long for a single video. The other reason is that now that I know this saw does work, I'd like to order that rubber boot for the secondary air intake, which is going to take a few days to get here. The reason is, while it's cool, the foam rubber, which is what the temporary boot is made of, works fine, but as the engine gets hotter, I feel as though the soft rubber will not seal as well as a solid piece of rubber. Also, when I was adjusting the carb, I noticed that there was something wrong with it. So in the next video, we're going to take a closer look at the throttle linkage, the carb, and of course the top cover, and try to find out how many more issues this chainsaw can have. Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or your own projects, and hope to see you in the next video.